Good morning. Hope you all are having a great Saturday so far. We are continuing in Philippians chapter 2. I had an incredible text yesterday morning that I feel like I did a horrible injustice of. There's so much to dive into there, and it was by far my longest video, and I felt like we only scratched the surface. So we are continuing today in Philippians 2:12 through 18, where Paul kind of circles back to, if you remember back in chapter 1, verse 27, his overall theme that he's chipping away at here, which is that he's imploring the Philippians to walk in a manner worthy of the gospel. So, as he continues back in that theme, remember, even our text yesterday was ultimately kind of a little bit of a tangent on the call to walk according to the gospel in unity. And now he's going to return back to that theme in verses 12 through 18. But it's certainly going to be connected to what we saw about Jesus yesterday. Let's read through it, and then we'll start to break it down. Paul writes this. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory, because I did not run in vain nor toil in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. You too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me. So in Philippians 2:12 through 18, Paul begins this text by saying, so then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, and that's an important word here. This is going to be kind of the key, the operative word of this whole text is the call to obedience. And if you remember yesterday, one of the statements about Christ in Philippians 2:5 through 11 is that Christ was obedient to the Father, and that trend of obedience all through that section is clear as Christ emptied himself and took on the form of a bondservant, being found in the likeness of human flesh, submitting himself to death. All of that was in obedience to the Father. And Paul continues that theme of obedience in Philippians 2:12 through 18, where he says, look, you've always obeyed. You did it both in my presence, and now you're doing it much more in my absence. So your obedience wasn't just to put on a show while I was with you. You've continued in your obedience. I've heard of the testimony of your obedience. And so he's encouraging them to press on in that obedience. Just as you have always obeyed, then what he calls them to do here is to continue in that obedience. And we're going to see three different encouragements in these three different sections throughout Philippians 2:12 through 18, in which he's encouraging them to press on in their obedience. We could kind of structure it that way. Three encouragements for pressing on in obedience. Thanks for enduring my handwriting, by the way. I know it's not impressive, but you guys have endured. Three encouragements for pressing on in obedience. All right, just as you've always obeyed, not in my presence only, but also much more in my absence. Here's this first encouragement. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Okay, his call is for them to work, specifically to work out their salvation. Now, that call to work is a call to obedience, all right? This call you've always obeyed, and now I'm calling you to continue to work out your salvation. Now, he's not telling them that they have to earn their salvation. He's not telling them that they have to work in such a way so that they receive salvation. He's saying if you are saved, if you have salvation, then you should work in a specific way. You need to work out your salvation. Your salvation should work itself out in your life. The evidence of your salvation should always be prevalent in your life. So he's calling them not to work so that they receive salvation, but continue to work their salvation out in their daily lives. And this is an important thing. Working out your salvation is not like a small, insignificant nuance of your Christian life. If you do it, that's good, but if you don't, it's not a big deal. No. Look at the terminology that Paul uses here. He says, work out your salvation with fear and with trembling. Work it out with fear and with trembling. In other words, there is severity in this issue. This is a serious matter. This is meant to kind of raise the alarm bells. This is not, obedience matters. Obedience matters in your life. This is not something that's just an insignificant footnote on the Christian life. No. We work out our salvation with fear and with trembling because our obedience matters. You know why it matters? Because every Christian is one who works out their salvation. This is to be the reality of every single Christian. That may seem like an overstatement, but that's actually exactly where Paul goes. If you are a Christian, if you are saved, then you will work out that salvation. Look at where Paul goes in verse 13. For the basis of you working out your salvation is revealed in verse 13. For it is God who is at work in you. Okay, so Paul just called the Philippians to work out their salvation, but then he follows that with the statement, for God is the one who is at work in you. So look at this. Here's this same word. He called them to work out their salvation, but now he says, you know who's at work in you? You know who enables you to work out your salvation? It's God. He is the one who is at work in you. So over in the beginning of this, he's saying you need to work out your salvation. But now he's saying God is the one who is at work in you. God is the one who enables you to work out your salvation. And so we can say with confidence that every Christian will be working out their salvation. Because if you are a Christian, then God is at work in you, enabling you to work out your salvation. But if you are one who is not working out your salvation with fear and trembling, then that would begin to indicate that God may not be at work in you, that God may not be within you, that you may not actually be a Christian. So this first call is a call to obey with God's strength. Obey with God's strength. God is the one who is at work in you, so work out your salvation with fear and trembling. I think that this may be the clearest verse in the entire New Testament about how the relationship between our obedience and God enabling our obedience works out. We cannot obey in and of our own strength. We only obey because He is at work in us, and yet we're still called to obey. In other words, the fact that God is at work in you doesn't mean that you just sit back and relax and don't actually strive to obey. The call is to strive with His strength. We're still called to work out our salvation. It's a command, and yet we're called to do that with the awareness that we can only do it because God is at work in us. And if we are working out our salvation, it points all of the glory to God who is working this out in us. So, the first encouragement for pressing on in obedience is obey with God's strength. Obey with God's strength. The call to obey doesn't negate the fact that God is at work. The fact that God is at work doesn't negate the fact that we're called to obey. We see these two in tandem, working together in our lives. So, obey with God's strength. But Paul doesn't stop there. He says, if you are working out your salvation, it shows that God is at work in you. And what is it that He's doing in us? He is the one who is willing and working within us for His good pleasure. Okay, so the desire to obey, the ability to obey, that all comes from God. He's at work in us, causing us to will, or we could say to want, and to work, or that's, to obey for his good pleasure. He makes us want it. He's the one that enables us to do it. It all comes from him. So obey. Obey with his strength. But secondly, in verses 14 through 16, he gives another encouragement for pressing on in obedience. Look at verses 14 through 16. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory, because I did not run in vain, nor toil in vain. Okay. Paul is giving them a very specific application to kick off this next encouragement for pressing on in obedience. He says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. That word grumbling means to complain. He's saying, don't complain. Don't complain. Disputing is arguing. Don't complain. Don't argue. In everything, in all things, we need to neither complain nor argue. Okay, why does Paul give that command? This so that statement answers the question, why? Why should we not complain or argue in anything as Christians? Here's his answer. So that you will prove to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Okay, so Paul says if you are doing all things without complaining or arguing, grumbling, or disputing, what you are doing is proving that you are blameless and innocent, that you are actually a child of God. Children of God are blameless and innocent because they are children of God. God has declared them to be blameless and innocent, and they should live in such a way. If you are living this way, you are above reproach, this says. Above reproach means no one can point a finger at you. No one can say, ha, you are a hypocrite, because you're living in such a way that isn't marked by complaining and arguing. In other words, the world is going to live in a way in which they are marked by complaining or grumbling and by arguing or disputing. He's saying we need to live differently. And I think we could actually summarize this whole point to say it that way. The second encouragement for pressing on in obedience is live differently. Live differently. Live differently than the world so that you stand out from the world, so that you are above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse. That is to say that this is a sinful and an evil, a twisted generation. That's the world that we live in, is the generation that we live in. You need to stand out amongst this sinful world. You need to look different in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. He says if you're doing that, then you are appearing as lights in the world. In the darkness and sinfulness of the world, you stand out as shining beacons because you live in such a way that isn't marked by complaining and arguing as the world is marked. Rather, you are holding fast. You are holding on tightly to the word of life. The word of life is the gospel. The word of life is the gospel. He's saying you are holding fast to the gospel. Remember, all of this stems from the call to walk worthy of the gospel. He's saying if you're living this way, you're holding fast to that gospel. You're holding on tight. You're not letting go, so that in the day of Christ, that is when Christ returns, I, Paul, will have reason to glory because I did not run in vain or toil in vain. In other words, all of my ministry to you has led to faithful fruit. And when Christ returns, I won't be sad. I'll have reason to glory because all of my work to you is manifesting itself in individuals that are holding fast the word of life. Isn't it fascinating that of all the things Paul could have told them to do here, what he encourages them in is to not grumble or dispute? Guys, this is an important reminder for us. Christians are not complainers. Christians are not complainers. Christians are not arguers. We don't dispute. We're unified. We find joy in our circumstances. Wow, what an opportunity for us in light of, again, the strange days that we are in as we're battling the coronavirus and quarantining and all that stands before us, to not complain and to not argue. There's certainly plenty of opportunity for us to do those things, and yet Paul says, do all things without complaining or arguing, so that we will appear different in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, blameless, innocent, above reproach. But he has one other encouragement for pressing on in obedience, and he gives that in verses 17 and 18. He says, even if I'm being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. Okay, so he's just said, I can't wait to see on the day of Christ you as a people of God that have held fast to the word of life. But even if I am poured out as a drink offering, that is another way of saying even if I die. Even if I die. But that death is not just dying like any other man. He says, even if I'm poured out as a drink offering, which is Old Testament sacrificial terminology. He says, even if I'm poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith. Your faith. He's saying, even if I die in ministry and in service to you. Paul is in chains because of his ministry of the gospel. He's currently in prison. And he says, even if I die because of my ministry to you, I rejoice. I rejoice and I share my joy with you all. Despite my circumstances, despite my imprisonment, even if I die for ministering to you, I'm joyful. And he calls them to do the same. This third encouragement is maintain joy. Rejoice. Look at verse 18. You too, I urge you, I'm begging you, I'm pleading with you, rejoice. Rejoice as I rejoice, and share your joy with me. Christians, regardless of their circumstances, students, remember this. Christians, regardless of their circumstances, are marked by joy. We're marked by joy. What an example Paul is. What an encouragement he is to us to press on in obedience. This is a text where we don't have to get too creative to find application in our lives. What's application? Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, knowing that God is at work in you. What's the application? Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you're testifying to the world around us that we are different. What's the application? Maintain joy, regardless of your circumstances. So I would point you to these for finding application in our lives, and I hope you find encouragement in that. I know these are challenging to me. They certainly have been as I've been studying them. And we will continue in Philippians. Remember, tomorrow's Sunday, so I won't be posting anything tomorrow, but you can watch for that. We will see you then. Bye.